Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this exciting session about using geospatial technology information for impact evaluation. My name is Sven Harten. I'm your bus driver today, so I'm going to make sure that we go on an interesting journey and hopefully arrive on time. Just a few words about our distinguished speakers. So we have Juha on the right-hand side here. He's the director of the Independent Evaluation Office of GEF. He spent a long career in evaluation at UN agencies, wrote many articles and books, he is by training a geographer in socioeconomic geography, which is a perfect link to Malte, my colleague on the right-hand side, who is also a geographer, worked in rural and regional planning. So at least we have two panelists here who should be able to speak the same language apart from English. I hope that that holds for you as well. Malte is an evaluator at DEVAL, which is the German Institute for Development Evaluation. He's been working with us for the last 2 years almost, and he's working on an interesting evaluation on the Philippines, where he'll be talking about. So, with no further delay, I'd like to invite Juha to start with his presentation. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm going to stand up and hopefully I'll see where my presentation is. So I'm going to talk about a couple of examples on using geospatial technology, especially in evaluating environmental impact. And I've written this article, or this presentation, with two of my colleagues, Gita Batra and Anupama Anand, who actually have been working on this thing. So why have we in the Global Environment Facility started using ICT for evaluations? And it's for several reasons. One is that you can actually claim that it's a fairly efficient way of doing evaluations, especially in the environmental field. You can do analysis at very different scales, from the global to the local and to ecologically meaningful scales. It is an objective and transparent way of doing impact evaluation, and you can verify the data in a very transparent manner. But there are, of course, some methodological challenges which pertain to things like counterfactual selection, assessing factors influencing outcomes, identifying drivers of environmental degradation, and so forth. And I'll come to these challenges also. So this is not only a Pollyanna presentation. My first example is we looked into land degradation projects in the GEF. We assessed GEF projects based on using geospatial and economic methods, but based on the UN desertification convention indicators of forest cover, vegetation productivity, and forest fragmentation to measure what our impact was. We looked into, well, first of all, we had to do a geocoding exercise and look into where exactly do our projects work. And this wasn't quite straightforward either, because the projects were often lacking specific geocoding. We looked into geospatial data, data sets that were derived from raw satellite data, other non-satellite data such as population, distance from the city, etc., that we generated for this evaluation based on the geocoding that we have. We looked into data integration involving biophysical and socioeconomic data. We did a matching exercise on a quasi-experimental method where we used to choose, which we used to choose statistically balanced control and treatment samples. So treatment being the ones where the GEF projects are located, and the control being obviously the ones similar places where you don't have GEF intervention. We did a causal tree analysis looking into, using a machine learning method to identify the factors that are affecting the outcomes and impact. And given the geographical heterogeneity of the land degradation projects, which were spread across semi-arid, arid, and humid tropics, to try to also account for local context in that sense. And we looked into then valuation of carbon sequestration, and this was important because this was actually in many ways the essence of the evaluation, because the projects had been developed to measure land degradation impacts, but our hypothesis was that because they work often in areas such as sustainable forest management and land management, so they would also have carbon sequestration impacts. So this basically, so what we try to do is to find the control groups, control areas for our projects using actually, so that we could have a counterfactual selection. So you could identify areas based on things such as distance from road, distance from cities, forest cover, and so forth, that you could compare with the areas where the projects were taking place. And then we did this machine learning exercise with the causal tree method to identify basically how interventions were intended to influence outcomes. Okay, so what did we find? We found many interesting things. So, for example, that it took an average of 4.5 to 5 years after the project was closed before you could actually see true impact. So we had to go back to older projects to actually and then identify what the outcomes were afterwards. We found out that access to electricity seemed to be a positively connected factor, and obviously here's one of these areas where you will actually have to speculate a little bit, because the satellite data will not tell you why, but we speculate that it is, for example, that where you have electricity, you have better access to irrigation, for example. A similar factor was that in some projects access to roads also showed up as an important factor associated with positive outcomes. Again, especially when it came to forest cover, being closer to cities was associated as a positive factor. Maybe very intuitively, you could also say that we found a very close relationship between that. If your project was in an area where the initial conditions were poorer, the results were better, or the change was bigger immediately. So we also applied a value for money approach to the evaluation, and we looked into, like I said earlier, so the projects were designed to look into land degradation per se, and didn't necessarily measure things such as carbon sequestration. So we took carbon sequestration as a variable, and we actually found that on average there were more than 43 tons per hectare of project areas where carbon was sequestered, and if we took an average return based on a median carbon value of $12 per ton, we could show that the land degradation projects also produced more than $1 per dollar invested in carbon sequestration, which is good, because this is beyond the impacts that you were expecting from the projects. And I'm sure that if you were to look into other areas, biodiversity conservation, for example, or other environmental factors, you would again find similar results, which could be then defined as co-benefits because they were beyond what the project was intended to achieve. Another example we looked into, we used in international waters, and we took the example of Lake Victoria, where Jeff has invested quite a lot of money, tens of millions of dollars, together with the World Bank and others, over 3 projects to manage the water hyacinth infestation and algae infestation in the lake. Again, we used satellite data, time series satellite data from the year 2000 up until last year, and this again showed that the initial projects that were, the Lake Victoria, some of you must have been there, and there's been a huge issue with this water hyacinth infestation, where the local people who live on the shores of Lake Victoria actually had years when they could actually not even go on the lake because the vegetation was so thick, so their boats were not able to access the lake, and which has a huge socioeconomic consequences, obviously. Now, the Jeff started a first project in the late 90s, which addressed the symptoms of the water hyacinth infestation. There were lots of mechanical solutions. They went with cutters. They tried different kinds of approaches to get rid of the infestation. But it took 3 projects before you actually started seeing impacts, and it went into a biological control method, which was developed together with the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture, which is an IFAD partner, obviously, for a long time. And then they realized that you cannot. So Lake Victoria is, as you will remember, is shared between Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, but you have upstream, you have the Rwanda and Burundi also, and you could see that the infestation was coming from Kagera River down, so you had to involve all of those countries. Our geospatial analysis was quite powerful in showing that there is a time lag in addressing these issues and having impact, but eventually the impact will be there. And you could see from this, I won't go into the details, but you could see that, you know, the blue area is good and the green and yellow is bad. So it took a lot of time. We applied these same kinds of technologies for an evaluation of Jeff's work on biodiversity conservation, and in particular with protected areas. And we took Mexico as a case study. So here's again, so we did a global analysis, and we used satellite data from the year 2000 until year 2016, and located where the Jeff projects were. But you know, this is at a fairly coarse scale. But we took Mexico as a case study for the reason that Jeff has been operating in Mexico for a long time, and with very large protected areas program. Again, what we did, we tried to use geospatial technologies to be able to identify again treatment groups, treatment areas where the projects are, and then similar areas which are ecologically and socio-economically similar in the country for as a best match control area. We looked into, to identify the best matches, we looked into factors such as forest cover percentage, forest loss, distance to forest edge, elevation, slope, topographic ruggedness, land use, and travel time to nearest city, distance to road, and population density. So to be able to really identify places which were similar. Again, we did it's very difficult to see, but this graph was first, you know, the left side graph shows what the, when you pair the Jeff and non-Jeff areas before matching exercise, you see that they don't really match. You don't see, okay, I give you that. But then you did, then we did a propensity score matching with these areas, and you could actually see clear overlaps. And as a result, again, we could do an evaluative exercise which showed that Jeff protected areas reduced forest cover loss by 23% more than other protected areas. Of course, kind of sad that, you know, we're talking about reduced deforestation rather than improvement, but still better. We took Yucatan Peninsula, where the Jeff has invested a lot of money and projects over the many years, and we moved from a 30-meter resolution and zoomed into 2.5-meter resolution. We collaborated with NASA on this. And this was very interesting because you could actually then start, when you zoom into much closer, you actually can start identifying factors why things are happening. So we looked into these protected areas in the Yucatan, where you could actually then identify that you had logging roads, you could identify that you had illegal cattle raising and cattle pens that had been established in the middle of the protected areas. So there, you know, that you go into much finer resolution, you can actually see better what is happening on the ground, and not only looking into, for example, issues such as forest cover change. But okay, so now the critical part of this whole thing. So you can. What I would argue is that what we have to do is that this is not the panacea. It's not. You cannot see everything from the sky. But you can combine methods and you can triangulate methods. So, you know, this is an example from a bamboo forest in Madhya Pradesh in India, where actually people are measuring with a measuring tape how the bamboo is growing. So that's valuable, but it's also very time consuming and very hard to make into at a larger scale. So we again here we use the geospatial technology and satellite imagery to measure what had happened, and we could see, because this is bamboo forest, so bamboo grows very fast, right? So the vegetation we found has been improving since 2010, looking into vegetation indexes. The average vegetation index had increased about 10% in less than 10 years, and so forth. So you could, when you combine these factors, where we used the satellite imagery to actually to measure objectively and from above the, you know, the ground what the actual vegetation index changes were and how the forest cover had increased. We at the same time we did a beneficiary survey on the ground using smartphones to measure environmental and livelihood outcomes and how people perceive these and how they have been affecting people's livelihoods actually. And so we used both on the ground research using smartphone technology and the high-level analysis of actual environmental changes from using satellite data. And when you use both of these, it helps you to triangulate the findings from fieldwork and the satellite data analysis. And so you could say that the field survey data helped answer the why questions, while the satellite data helped us to know actually what happened and where when it comes to the environmental factors. And the environmental factors are what the justification of Jeff's work is. So there are obviously some challenges and limitations to using this technology. So first of all, you do need quite a lot of computing power and technical skills to be able to interpret the satellite data and so forth. And we have collaborated with University of Maryland just down the road from our offices, and as well as with NASA to help to do with these things. And actually my colleague Anupam Anand, who helped put together this presentation, he just got a PhD in geography from University of Maryland, and we hired him to develop our work in these areas. There is an uneven availability and accuracy of contextual variables, and these vary between countries and sites. And obviously, like I said earlier, so what you see from the sky, you can see a lot of things that have happened, but you don't necessarily understand why these have happened and how. So you do need the ground truthing and verification. So really, my last slide is that what you need to do when you do this kind of evaluations is that you have to partner with agencies such as those that I mentioned, who actually have technical competence in doing this work. But also, I'm a great believer in mixed methods. This is not the panacea. You have to combine methods from different types of evaluation approaches, and on the ground and remotely. But I really think that we do need to continue exploring the use of these kind of new technologies, and there's a lot of potential in different kinds of approaches, not only the satellite data, but using drones and deep learning, Internet of Things, and computational social sciences and whatever. But so we can approach evaluation actually as a dynamic learning process where we also learn at the same time as we do these things. Thanks very much.
All right. Thank you, Juha.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk here and to present a little bit of DEVAL's work in terms of using geospatial methods in impact evaluation. And what I'm going to present to you today is more like a workshop report, what are we currently doing in one of our impact evaluations centered around land use planning in the Philippines, and mostly how we deal with challenges in this evaluation using geospatial methods. My main point for today, and this is maybe also the takeaway message right away here at the start, is that geospatial analysis can be a really good starting point to leverage, let's say, more sophisticated technologies in evaluation, as it's rather approachable in the way I'm going to present it to you today. So as a starting point for evaluation units that are approaching new technologies, I would say this is a really good and feasible approach, and this is what I would like to stress today. And when it comes to more sophisticated methods, moving on from geospatial methods even into bigger fields like remote sensing, artificial neural networks, machine learning, and so forth, this can be seen as a first step then. But what we really need to keep in mind is, and this is also something I would like to point out, that using technology should not be centered around using the technology for the own sake, but for answering new and established evaluation questions and to gain new insights in the evaluative work. So my presentation will be structured around three main questions. Firstly, I would like to show you how we at DEVAL experienced the, let's call it, too big to evaluate questions in our land use planning intervention that I'm going to show you in a minute. Then and this is the main focus then, what are our practical solutions for these challenges? And lastly, how can you structure workflows, project workflows with maybe new established geoanalysis teams? And I would like to share some experience from our work at DEVAL here. So DEVAL was assigned to do an evaluation of one of the German Society for International Cooperation projects. The intervention we are looking at is called Simple, but actually it's not so simple at all. However, it's a project aimed to enhance land use planning in the Philippines and the central Philippine region of the Visayas, relatively impoverished region there. Land use planning in the Philippines has been fragmented and rather, well, let's say, inefficient in the past years. There was land use planning, there was a lot of bureaucracy, but the planning itself, the management of land, was not so efficient at all. And the GIZ sent in experts and did a lot of trainings and write-shops and workshops to improve land use planning and to equip land use planners in the region with the sufficient tools and knowledge to engage in better comprehensive planning that is encompassing the whole municipal territories and not just maybe the small settlement area that they used to plan, but all area also covered by other different governmental authorities that were ignored before, but also by integrating information from village, from local people to get more expertise and a broader view on land use planning. And this intervention was then handed over to DEVAL for a first impact assessment. What is actually the results of this land use planning intervention? And well, as Sven already told, I have not so much experience in evaluation yet. I'm rather new to the community. So when I joined DEVAL and joined the Philippine project, I was pretty much, let's go to work. It's going to be an easy task. We had a data collection that was already running in 2012. We had data on 3,000 households in 300 villages and 100 municipalities, pretty straightforward. We had a sampling frame already with treatment and control municipalities, so actually that looked pretty good. Let's go to the data collection in 2016, do some geocoding, it's going to be good, quasi-experimental design, propensity score matching, the standard so far, and I was really looked pretty much like a straightforward evaluation. But when we started looking into more details, that's actually when the problem started. First, there was Typhoon Yolanda, one of the main tropical cyclones in the 2013 region that devastated especially the area we were working in. So we had municipalities that were basically scratched off the map by this tropical cyclone, and official statistics reported more than 6,000 casualties and more than 1,000 people missing. So this whole area that has been in the intervention of the GSE was devastated now, and following this this horrible event, there was a huge inflow of international aid and donor assistance coming to the region, flooding the region basically, doing reconstruction, doing humanitarian relief, which is good. But now it got really complicated. What are actually the effects of the intervention we are looking at that is now kind of buried under a pile of international aid and support? So this was the first problem we encountered. And secondly, the intervention aimed at outcomes that were so large that survey data alone would not have been able to get true outcomes and get true results. For instance, the program and the planning approach also wanted to reduce deforestation and illegal logging, but also to increase people's resilience in terms of natural hazards and natural disasters. So this goal, while it can be sort of assessed by survey data, is simply not sufficient if you just look at it from that perspective. And this is also another problem we had. And lastly, the intervention is taking place in a real-world situation where treated persons are not confined to their municipal spaces and doing their planning in their small chamber, which is good, but they are interacting. There's a lot of information exchange going on between municipalities, but also between other governmental authorities. There is a sort of intended and unattended diffusion of knowledge, and this can in turn then sort of contaminate our control municipalities that we have identified. So this is also something we had to account for. So now we had let's go to the challenges now. We had the problem that Typhoon Yolanda, and we had very little comprehensive data out on how the municipalities that we were looking at were actually affected by the storm. And of course we had a self-assessment on our survey, but that kind of varies because like the perception on individual affectedness, there's no standard way for measuring it, or there is, but you will get different answers, and it's hard to validate then. And what we did is actually we looked at data we gathered from the GFS, the Global Forecasting System, so worldwide weather data available throughout the world, and we collected this data, did calculations on the track of the typhoon, did some kind of statistical analysis, and then were able to approximate the exposure of our municipalities to this tropical cyclone. Let me say, we didn't really do that to be able to get a scientific, precise measurement, but sort of an idea of how our municipalities and our treatment were affected by the storm. This was actually pretty easy and pretty fast. The data is right available. You just need to grab it from the internet, do some calculations, do GIS mapping, put it on a map, and then transform this GIS data back into your survey data. And we used it, for instance, in the propensity score matching of our treatment and control municipalities to get in sort of comparable results between the effectiveness of the storm, but also to do subgroup analysis of households of municipalities that were affected, let's say, the most severely by the storm. And of course we did validation because external data always needs validation, so we kind of did a validation using the official reports on the storm, and we got results that were, in our things and in our perspective, for the purpose that we had in mind, fairly good. So we were happy with that. The cons about this approach is that you still need a lot of information about the local condition, about, for instance, if you have wind speeds and wind directions, that's good enough, but you also need, for instance, knowledge about coastal exposition, as storm surges were the main cause of human loss of human life during the storm. Secondly, we have the large-scale outcomes that we wanted to look at and that survey data could not grasp specifically, for instance, like the assessment of forest cover change and the exposure to natural hazards. And our solution there was to use available remote sensing data and remote vector data that is basically available on the internet for free. Everybody can use it, and we used it to validate these outcomes. Looking at forest cover, there's a huge and very interesting data set available by Hansen and colleagues that was published in 2013. They compiled, using remote sensing data, forest cover on a global scale on a 30-meter cell size resolution. So very good, very precise data that you can look up. And we did some calculation there, took endline and baseline point, and corrected, of course, for the impact of the tropical cyclone again, because that was a huge cause of deforestation. But controlling for these effects, we were then able to really calculate the change in forest cover in our municipalities in treatment and control, and when we're able to account for, on a quantitative scale, what kind of effect and the intervention had in these municipalities, and on a scale that is very good for us to use and to calculate. A very good approach in that way. Pretty much the same thing we did for an assessment of natural hazards. We did a simplified model of natural hazards using also remote sensing data, mostly digital terrain models. Again, the forest cover data, but also this time vector data publicly available on rivers, on streams, on infrastructure, and so forth. And we're able to extract sort of the localized hazards in our area, and we were able to create hazard maps, as you can see here in this slide. So this helped us a lot to contextualize the survey data we collected in our region and to really be able to compare the effectiveness or the exposure of households to natural hazards compared to their self-assessment and so forth. So this was, again, only done by publicly available data. It's all open source and can be basically done by everybody. And lastly, the challenge that we had associated with the contamination of our control groups, like the real-world environment our intervention is taking place in, and that planners are exchanging ideas, discussing, and there's policy diffusion. And what we did, because we have geographies, we have geocoded data, we defined and refined distance matrix data and basically did spatial econometric approach to that. So we calculated this distance matrix and and then assessed spatial autocorrelation of outcomes on the level. And there are different approaches to that. There's the straightforward approach that you can see on the slide here, that you just use direct geographic distance on a simplified scale. But this doesn't really work in the Philippines. We have a very diverse geography going on. We have maybe communities that are actually living pretty close together, but basically can't be reached because there are mountains, there are streams, and so forth. And well, we tried different approaches, also following Boschma's paper, very interesting, on different aspects of proximity that he conceptualized. In the end, what we did, we calculated the simple matrix and then compared it with a travel distance matrix using the Google Maps API. Having the locations of municipal halls, it was pretty easy to put it into the API, do the calculation, and then to be able to control for spatial autocorrelation of our outcomes. And one thing I can tell, there is no much spatial autocorrelation. So we were able, and this was also a very good finding for us, that we could say, okay, this is not so much of a problem for us that there was so much diffusion going on. In the real world, it would have been really good, but for this, we were quite happy with the result. And lastly, maybe a few words on how you structure work in geoanalysis teams, as we have been actually engaged in creating a new team. When I joined Eval, I was the first person. Now we have 2 persons working in geoanalysis. And the first thing we had to do was actually to find a common project goal, to find a common language, as we are working in interdisciplinary teams, and the understanding there is sometimes quite different. And also the expectation management you have to do concerning outcomes or concerning deliverables, something that seems to be very easy, can take actually a lot of time, and it can be the other way around. So finding a good, I would say, common language and do that really helped a lot. And we found a good workflow. As for me, I'm coming from the geography discipline. I'm working with desktop GIS, which is good for smaller scale analysis, for visualization, for proofing and remote sensing. but not so much for calculation and automation and geoprocessing and so forth, as it takes a lot of computational power. But my colleague, as a political science, is very good in R, and we established a good workflow here between the two worlds, let's say the desktop GIS and the R calculation environment. And as we had the survey data that is actually structuring our work, our project inflow, we got a very good combination of two worlds here, I would say. Lastly, only very short, people tend to ask me, where do you get the data from? Where do I need to get started if I didn't really work with that? And I always say, and I always give the most evaluative answers of all, it depends. It's really problematic that there's no one-stop solution to get data, but I would say a good start is for instance, publicly available remote sensing data is the Earth Explorer of the USGS, Global Forest Change, and also to look at OpenStreetMap, which also, but instance have to be validated depending on the location where you work. There's no one-stop solution, and that's maybe the thing I would like you to take home with. You can also look at commercial vendors if your financial requirements work there. It can be quite costly in the end, but the quality is of course very high. Yes, okay, maybe to sum up now, this was really a little fast talk, I'm sorry. I wanted to show you in my examples what is feasible in everyday's work, and this is maybe the takeaway message. Everything we did was able in the constrained time and resource environment that everybody is facing in evaluative work. So what I showed today is actually quite easy to achieve given the resource constraints everybody has. And with increasing complexity, there's basically no border where to stop. You can just add in more information, you can just add in more data and get it more complex, get it even better. So that's coming back to the first slide. Consider it maybe a first start into the use of ICT and geoanalysis. This can be a very good first step into use more technologically sophisticated methods in evaluation. But lastly, and I would like to come back to my colleague here, in the end, this is also a tool to answer evaluation questions, and we should not forget that. And of course, methods we presented today should not replace existing methods in evaluation like quantitative and qualitative analysis, but should complement methods that we already use. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Juha and Malte. We've got about 14 minutes left for questions. So I'd like to open up the floor to you. I'm going to take 3 questions in a row. So who wants to go first? TechnoServe, the colleague from TechnoServe.
Excuse me. First, I'd like to compliment both speakers. I think clearly their knowledge and approach to evaluation and in mixed methods, the use of different techniques to complement a holistic approach is really fantastic. So we're working a lot in geospatial techniques as well, and I'm curious as to a couple of things. First, on the Water Hyacinth project, I wanted to ask, what was the actual variable that made the difference? I'm curious because I work in Kenya, and this was a huge issue and suddenly went away magically. So please demystify that. Second question for both speakers. You've both mentioned the use of machine learning, and in one case specifically for theory of change development or problem tree development. If you can maybe talk a little bit, I know you don't want to get too technical, but if you can just give us an overview of how exactly that might work, because I'd like to think about integrating these kind of techniques into some of the work we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please. See in front. Oh, and please be so kind to introduce yourself. Wendy.
Thank you. My name is Susanna Fru. I work for UNESCO. As a fellow geographer, I was very intrigued by the presentations, and some 30 years ago when remote sensing was a new discipline, this was very far away. Just a very small question. First of all, the resources that this kind of technology requires. You, Malte, made the point that this is all available, but Juha went to NATO, he went to the university, so I'd like to know the cost dimension. And then I'd like to ask you why you didn't work through UNOSAT, which is a UN program set up to help UN organizations use satellite technology, and you name what.
Thank you. One more. Yes, please.
Good morning. I'm Josep Villa, Evaluation Officer from the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization in Vienna. Just in line with the last presentation, I would like to note that I had the opportunity to attend last week, well, 2 weeks ago, to the Global Platform 2017 in Mexico, in Cancun, the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. And in one of the side events, I was there not as evaluation officer, but from the technical side, as a physicist in the Earth and atmospheric sciences, because our organization, what does is monitor the Earth, again, nuclear tests, so we are providing some information available. But what I wanted to say now, and I was just collecting my notes, is that there is a working group named Global Open Data for Monitoring the Sendai Targets, which in fact, it aligns with SDGs. So the surprise is that there, many people didn't know how much data is available to perform the work. So I just wanted to let you know this, and because some of you may be interested on that, and there is a working group, and most of the people said they didn't know that half of that exists. So this was a huge surprise, and believe me that there is a huge amount of information from different sources, NASA, UN organization, or the Red Cross even. So I just wanted to let you know this.
Thank you. So Juha, shall we start with 2 questions for you first?
Okay, thanks very much. Using machine learning to develop these problem trees and the theory of change, I think that's a, again, for all of these things, I think what we need to do to start with is to go through literature and to understand what science and what research tells us. And that's interesting because, so many evaluations in the past have ignored the existing knowledge. And nowadays when we, well, okay, so we work in an environmental field which is very driven in data-driven, information, research-driven, and so on. But I would argue that it's the same for every other field also, that we should start a major evaluation always by understanding what research tells us. And then you can feed these factors into your models and so on, and actually like test the hypotheses in some ways. On the resources, I have to say that this hasn't been particularly expensive for us. For example, I mean, the universities are not more expensive than other consultants for that matter, actually, and when you can interest them in areas which advances their own research agendas, it's quite easy to do that. And for example, even in NASA, so we had a deal with NASA. They have a postgraduate program where you have recent graduates who are doing work and who have to collaborate, who have to do some practical projects. And so we could engage those people. We just basically paid for their costs, and actually in one case we sent 5 of them to Kenya to do some field verification and so on in economic class, so as they are students. So it doesn't have to be. You can have many innovative ways of working together with these partners also.
And just a word about the water hyacinth. The water hyacinth. What was the cost? Just very, very short, 1 sentence.
On the water hyacinth. The water hyacinth. The infestation is on the retreat, and we have been able to monitor this from satellite imagery from 2000 onwards over a period of 16 years. The projects took about 12 years and there were 3 of them, and it took a long while for them to identify what actually were the reasons and how they could address them, but it had to do with then addressing really the root causes of the infestation coming from upstream from Kagera River and all of that, and then using biological control methods for that.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe one point on the question on Susanna, resource constraints. Yes, I would say in our evaluative work, it is certainly a problem. And as I say, it's really a really good approach to do a lot of cooperation with universities and third-party research institutions. However, sometimes the project and the evaluation timelines are not so well aligned, as university projects have a different time scope and evaluations kind of need timely results. So I think there needs to be some sort of way to at least align this sort of time frame to be able to engage in good cooperation. But I would say that's certainly one of the points that cooperation needs to be facilitated. On the point of global open data, yes, thank you very much for your input there. Again, I'm always learning. There's so much more information and so much more data available, so I'm really grateful for your input here. I think this is also one situation I'm always encountering. It's a lot of looking for data and finding good sources. But I think what we need to be better at is networking and putting our knowledge together, that everybody knows who's a practitioner, who's working on the data, where to find it. So thank you very much for your input there. I think we are good at that point, but we certainly need to do better.
All right, if you're quick, we can do another round of questions. Is there anything? No, I don't see. Oh, Juha, you want to?
Just to follow up on Malte's point also in some ways. So you have to find suitable methods and suitable approaches for evaluation, and not everything has to be at this level. And for example, so we did this massive evaluation of impact and effectiveness of protected areas and protected area systems for the GEF. And it's just been a huge investment over 25 years, but we didn't have particular timeline for it. So we decided to go for a huge impact evaluation methodology using both field work and remote sensing and all of this work. It cost us about $1 million and took us 2.5 years. We don't do that very often, obviously. And you have other, now there's, for example, Andy Rowe from Canada has developed this rapid impact evaluation methodology that we have been using in some other projects recently, which is obviously then cost $50,000, and you can get reliable information. So courses for horses, right?
Yes, please, Michael.
Michael Bamberger. Thank you for 2 very interesting presentations. Just to flag one of the unique aspects of the evaluations you've been looking at is the very long time frame that you work with, which is a real challenge for most kinds of evaluation, including you don't normally have retrospective data, which you can have in your case. And the other point related to that is something which tends to be very much overlooked in evaluation is a trajectory analysis of estimating over what time period you can expect impacts to occur. And most evaluations are forced to complete their evaluation before a lot of impacts are likely to occur just because of administrative reasons. It's a 4-year project. So I think there's a lot of very interesting potential lessons from your kinds of evaluations. And hopefully today and tomorrow we can think, can these kinds of tools be applied to other kinds of evaluation where these databases may not be quite so readily available. So thank you very much for 2 very informative presentations.
I think actually that this is a great closing statement, because looking at the time and at our colleague from IFAD, I'd like to thank you all for participating. I'd like to thank our speakers for 2 very inspiring presentations. I'm going away with mixed methods, innovative partnerships, and you can sometimes start small, grow big, and there's some really exciting, also complex uses that were presented. So I'm very much looking forward to the rest of the 2 days. Thank you.